What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here, and back to review Dumb Money, a movie which feels like the first of the fall movies. And I know technically fall doesn't begin for another week, but by the time this movie goes into wide release, it will be a fall movie because it's in limited release as of tomorrow, and then expanding to wide release on September 29th. And as far as spoilers go, I don't even really know if the term applies to this movie because this movie captures the events of January 2021 when an online army of retail investors managed to put the squeeze on two major hedge funds when they decided to go all in on buying GameStop shares at the same time when those hedge funds had been shorting GameStop and hoping for it to fail. But I should mention that this movie was directed by Craig Gillespie, who's probably most famous for his movie I, Tonya, but he also directed Pam and Tommy, and this movie reunites Gillespie with a lot of the cast from both that show as well as that movie. But it was written or adapted by Lauren Schuker Blum and Rebecca Angelo, and it's based on the 2021 book, The Antisocial Network by Ben Mizraich. And that book chronicles the GameStop short squeeze of January 2021. And I think one of the best assets of this movie is the ensemble cast, which includes Paul Dano, Pete Davidson, Vincent D'Onofrio, America Ferrera, Nick Offerman, Anthony Ramos, Sebastian Stan, Shailene Woodley, and Seth Rogen. And the author, Ben Mizraich, if his name sounds familiar, it's because he also wrote the book The Accidental Billionaires, and that book served as the foundation for The Social Network, which was adapted by, oh my god, I'm blanking on his fucking name, the West Wing guy, Aaron Sorkin, and directed by David Fincher. And I think rightly or wrongly, people are going to be making a lot of comparisons between Dumb Money and The Social Network in terms of its merits or lack thereof, which is both fair and unfair. Two wildly different stories, two wildly different concepts, but this kind of new subgenre of movies about business or true life stories about businesses either rising to great success or completely falling to pieces, it is becoming increasingly popular, and every once in a while we'll get a good one like The Big Short. And I really enjoyed Blackberry, which came out earlier this year. But sometimes these topics are better for a great documentary. And I guess the big question for all these kinds of movies is always, is it more fun or more exciting or more dynamic following it in real time with all the YouTube commentary and all the reactions and then eventually the mainstream media coverage? Or is it better to see a great documentary with all the talking heads opining after the fact? Or is it better to see a feature film that tries to kind of capture it all in one 2-hour self-contained story? And I would say that if you're hoping for a repeat of the phenomenon of The Social Network, lower your expectations. I mean, for a lot of people, The Social Network is one of the best movies of that particular decade. And I would agree, it was absolutely outstanding. I saw it multiple times. But not every movie needs to be as good as The Social Network. I mean, this movie, it held my interest. I was engaged. I was entertained. I kind of lightly chuckled throughout. So I'd argue that this movie is very solid. It's very enjoyable. And I could tell that my theater or my crowd was into it. It's got a very satisfying ending, but it falls well short of just the electricity of following the story in real time 2.5 years ago, where I was just completely, totally knocked sideways by just the delirious insanity of the true life story of Wall Street bets and all these various kind of retail investors banding together to put the squeeze on these major hedge funds. And in the interest of full disclosure, I should admit that I do a little investing on my own. I am a retail investor. I'm part of what's called the Dumb Money, or at least that's how it's described by the hedge funds in the movie. And Dumb Money is basically just the average everyday Joe who wants to buy a few shares of Apple or Microsoft or whatever, but they don't have the inside information and they don't have like the enormous power of putting billions behind your bets, where like just by the nature of like the size and scope of your bet, you can move the market and influence your investments or the outcome. But when it came to GameStop, I did not participate. I watched from a distance. I was fascinated, but I have a very simple philosophy when it comes to investing. I pick a handful of companies that I really believe in, I invest, and then I step back and I basically hold those positions, sometimes for years before I make any additional moves. And another part of my philosophy is that I never short anything. And so I took kind of a perverse sense of delight in watching these giant hedge funds that have been shorting the hell out of GameStop and watching them lose billions on a daily basis. I just feel like sometimes I mean, I went to business school. I understand the rationale and I totally understand the strategy of short selling a stock. I guess in the end, just emotionally, philosophically, temperamentally, I'm just not into short selling. I'm just much more of a believer in finding projects and or stocks you believe in and supporting them, whether I'm investing in like a small micro budget independent film or a giant company like Netflix. But getting back to the flick and the direction of Craig Gillespie, I wouldn't necessarily say that I'm a fan, or I don't identify as a fan, but I do see some of his stuff. Like when I watch movies like I, Tonya or a show like Pam and Tommy. I mean, Pam and Tommy, I basically was watching for the outrageous moments. The rest I couldn't have really cared less about. But his style, it always strikes me as like a watered down, derivative version of the late 90s period of Paul Thomas Anderson. And some might argue that the late 90s period of Paul Thomas Anderson was derivative of like late 80s, early 90s Martin Scorsese. And so we're getting like a copy of a copy of a copy, or a scan of a scan. And I just don't think Craig Gillespie has the chops to deliver a movie like The Social Network. David Fincher is one of the world's greatest directors, but I think Gillespie, obviously, he's got an eye for interesting material, an eye for interesting projects, although he's doing friggin' Cruella 2 for his next movie. Obviously, somebody backed up a dump truck of money for him to do that movie, but I feel like that is clearly a waste of his talents. I might not think that he's the next Paul Thomas Anderson, but he should definitely be doing better than Cruella 2. But who knows? Maybe that movie will make $500 million or $1 billion, and he'll get the last laugh. But I think one of the main reasons that this movie works, and it does work, is that the chemistry between Paul Dano and Shailene Woodley is first rate. You absolutely believe it in your heart that this is a loving couple with basically, they start the movie with like 90 grand in their savings account that they're investing all in on GameStop, when he just has this theory that the stock is undervalued and that people are ignoring the underlying fundamentals and that the short sellers are getting it wrong. And it gets very easy to get on board, as they're basically like the lone voice in a giant conversation where everybody thinks that GameStop's day is over and that they're going to fail. And the enthusiasm you'll feel, or I guess like the rush of adrenaline you'll feel as more and more people get on board, is exciting. As you see, I think the price at one point peaked around like $4.50, and it starts around like $3.50. I should say it starts around $3.50 at the beginning of the flick, and at one point it reaches a peak of around $450 a share before it comes back down to earth. But it is quite a roller coaster ride. And then rounding out the rest of the cast, we have a couple of characters who represent the various hedge funds that are shorting GameStop, and we have several other characters who represent basically like the everyday average retail investor who have chosen to get on board with Keith Gill's prediction or his philosophy or just his position on the stock. And of these various characters that are following Wall Street bets and getting on board and refusing to sell until they see Keith Gill sell, I'd say that Anthony Ramos, he does the best job of all of them. I first saw him in the latest Transformers movie, which was not a particularly good movie, but as an actor, he's a very talented guy, and so I enjoyed his story arc. And as far as the hedge funds go, we have Seth Rogen as basically the face of this fund that is losing billions per day as a result of all these people getting together and buying GameStop right at a time when Seth Rogen's character has bet that the stock is going to fail. And he basically ends up having to get bailed out by some of his fellow hedge fund managers, played by Nick Offerman and Vincent D'Onofrio. And I'd say all three of those guys do a pretty damn good job of capturing just how those personas operate, the way they behave, the way they interact. And I think the movie reaches its peak, or it really crescendos, when they encourage the character played by Sebastian Stan to remove the buy button on the app Robinhood. Because for people who remember, it was through the app Robinhood, which doesn't even require you to have a bank account, where people were making a lot of their transactions related to GameStop. And the part of the story that's most infuriating in both real life as well as in the movie, and the one that's going to fill people with the most rage, is when you see Robinhood removing this one option to buy the stock, which basically halts all the momentum of the people that are buying the stock, giving a little bit of relief to the short sellers, and basically halting all the momentum that had driven the stock up to the heights of $450 a share. And it's just a perfect example of how the entire system is rigged against the small retail investors, and is rigged in favor of a handful of people in the billionaire class who can basically manipulate the market to their advantage, even if you have millions upon millions of people out there that are trying to drive a stock in a different direction. Because as the character Keith Gill articulates on several occasions throughout the movie, in an ideal world, the stock market should be a level playing field where if you've got a little bit of money and you do a little bit of research and you have a little bit of luck, You can make a little bit of cash by investing in the companies that you believe in, but it gets increasingly easy to become cynical about the whole process when you see a handful of individuals rigging the system to their advantage when they see things are not going the way that they predicted. And another aspect of the movie that I really enjoyed was how it completely and deftly avoided the preachy, sanctimonious chest thumping that I feared was going to be a part of the movie in advance. I've got a little bit of a negative bias against Seth Rogen, where I enjoy him as a comedic performer, but when he gets involved in certain projects, it just feels like at a certain point he's like, it's time to basically shovel down people's throats our message, our worldview, and it almost feels like you got like a giant garbage truck kind of backing up and like, going up at an angle and just dumping it all in your face. And I don't even mind a little bit of messaging, but try to be a smuggler, or at least hide it. Try to use a little subtlety. And Seth Rogen sometimes just forgets that key message. So who knows? Maybe it was the screenwriters, Lauren Schuker Blum and Rebecca Angelo, who chose to avoid the preachy, sanctimonious stuff that I feared was going to be a part of the movie. So they opted instead for heartfelt emotion and how people's lives were both negatively and positively impacted by this crazy roller coaster ride. And one of my only real complaints about the movie was how they went so far into kind of the lives and the drama and the heart and soul of the story. They did so at the expense of kind of the crunchier side, or the more analytical side of this phenomenon. I was actually hoping for a little more math, a little more quant-based breakdown of what went down, like what's involved when you short sell a stock. And more importantly, what's involved with a short squeeze when a lot of investors decide to go against the view of a couple of hedge funds that might be shorting a particular stock. And I just would have, I guess I would have appreciated a few more scenes where you could show those scenes like in business school, just to really break down the whole phenomenon. I think for people who want a moving story, they will be satisfied. But I think the nerdier side, like the people who really actually are interested and being a retail investor, and to what extent the industry has changed since the GameStop phenomenon to avoid this kind of situation in the future, I think those people might walk away a little unsatisfied that there just wasn't enough kind of a granular detail of the phenomenon to satisfy their curiosity. But if what you're looking for is a movie that'll reinforce your frustration or even your rage at how the system sometimes feels rigged against the little guy, this movie will definitely reinforce that worldview. I mean, one of the most infuriating parts of the story is when the Reddit room, Wall Street Bets, gets shut down for basically like objectionable language or whatever. I mean, it's completely, totally absurd. But if not for this chat room on Reddit where everybody's talking about GameStop and whether or not they should buy, sell, or hold, but at a certain point, that Reddit room gets shut down for a couple days for a total bullshit excuse. I mean, if you're going to shut down a Reddit room for harsh language, you might as well shut down the whole goddamn internet. I mean, go to any YouTube channel, any chat room on any given day, you're going to see some unforgivable language, and that's just part of online culture. But it's just yet another part of this giant orchestrated effort to destroy the hopes and aspirations of the little guy in favor of a couple of hedge funds. So the movie does a good job of capturing that. But I don't think it's on the level of The Social Network. I don't think it's on the level of The Big Short. I don't think it's on the level of BlackBerry. And I hope more and more movies will be made in this genre. I don't even know what is kind of like the term. I hate to just call it like business movies, but that basically is what they are. But the biggest question, the most important question, is whether or not you should head to a theater and throw down your hard-earned cash to see it and get the theatrical experience. And I guess I would say maybe. Like if you absolutely love the trailer and you're absolutely enthralled by the story, definitely go see it. But there's nothing about this movie that feels inherently cinematic, whereas like The Social Network absolutely feels cinematic. But I would say when it comes to the look of the movie, the flavor of the movie, just the overall approach, it feels a bit like a streamer, or as we used to say back in the 90s, that movie's a rental. But I think Sony totally disagrees with me. I'm reading here on Wikipedia. Back in October of 2022, Sony Pictures bought both the domestic and international distribution rights for $20 million. It was originally going to be an MGM movie, but goddamn, $20 million? That's a hell of an acquisition. But it's not nearly as expensive as I think it was either 100 or 120 that was spent by Amazon for the movie Air. I mean, Air was made for 90 and then sold to Amazon. I mean, that was a colossal sum of money. I could not believe how much Amazon spent on that movie. So it's not nearly as big a bet as that. But I think, yeah, for a $20 million investment, depending upon how things go at the theater, Sony should do all right. They should get their money back. I don't think this movie is going to be the next friggin' Barbie. but I think it should do just fine. And if you're a fan of Shailene Woodley and Paul Dano, yeah, they're absolutely fantastic in this. I actually haven't seen that many shows and movies with Shailene Woodley, and as I was watching, I was like, all right, I get it. Now I understand why so many people love and adore her. She's one of those actresses where you can just tell the camera likes her. Like, she's just an incredibly likable performer. And Paul Dano, I mean, goddamn, he's been giving us great performances ever since There Will Be Blood, like 15, 16 years ago. There's an easy case we made for him as one of the most talented actors of his generation. So I paid to see this in the theater because I'm a movie-going junkie, and I was just thrilled to have something to go see again. But some people will go see this in the theater and be like, ugh, like this kind of feels like a microwave cheeseburger at a gas station. Like, I could have easily stayed home and watched this. So once again, if you're dying to see like deeper explorations of this particular topic, or the trailer really jumps out at you, definitely go see it in the theater. But otherwise, yeah, you can totally afford to wait and see it at home. But that's all I've got to say about this movie for now. Hope you enjoyed this reaction and review. If so, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell. And if you want to tell me how wrong I was with some of my takes, let me know on Twitter at Colbrax. But I hope everybody has an amazing weekend. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.